community that is as connected as a forest ecosystem. So just think about that for a moment. What would that look like? Forests are home to more than 3/4 of the world's life on land, so they have much to teach us. They are complex webs of plants, animals, microbes, and other organisms which interact with the chemical and physical features of their environment. These ecosystems take on many forms depending on the species, geology, topography, and climate of the particular site. And while a thimble of forest topsoil may contain more than 20,000 organisms, making it difficult to completely understand how each species influences and interacts with others, we do know a lot about how the larger organisms, such as trees, interact and influence their surroundings. Simply put, trees improve air quality, provide oxygen and climate amelioration, conserve water, preserve soil, and support wildlife. Tree diversity not only increases productivity and other essential ecosystem functions, tree-to-tree interactions have a positive effect on key ecosystem functions. But we're not here today to talk about forests and trees, but about sustainable and equitable transportation. So if a community were as connected as a forest ecosystem, what could we expect? It would be healthy for all elements of life, nurturing and generous, and would promote healthy lifestyles for everyone. The community would feature regenerative spaces for people as well as natural ecosystems. It would include places that are walkable, bikeable, and have affordable transportation. And this sustainable and equitable transportation would create resilient community connections and provide universal access to community services and to nature and place. So these may be lofty goals, but they are important for our well-being and the well-being of the natural ecosystems we inhabit. So as we consider the future of transportation in our community and others, which our panelists will discuss today, let's keep in mind the image and idea of the forest ecosystem and strive for the connectedness and resilience that it demonstrates. Thank you, and I look forward to this discussion. I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Ms. Locker. That was very inspiring and thought-provoking, so thank you very much for that. Next, we will jump in further into the topic of transportation with Jessie Clausen, Engagement and Projects Coordinator at the Office of Sustainability, who will give us an overview of current transportation projects at the University of Manitoba.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here. And like many of us, I'm preparing to return to campus for the first time in a long time. To help you plan your trip sustainably, I encourage you to visit our website at umanitoba.ca/sustainability. You may find a carpool partner with the university's subscription to Go Manitoba. You can learn how to access a bike cage or rent a bike locker, find transit options to Fort Garry and Bannatyne campuses, and coming later this spring, watch for more electric vehicle charging options on Fort Garry, including 6 new level 2 chargers and 20 level 1 stalls. Finally, keep an eye out for more to come as we begin to develop a zero emissions transportation plan at the university. This plan will map out how we can reach our climate action goals in the transportation sector in the years and decades to come. Now I'll pass things back to my colleague, Maddie Mitchell, to introduce today's panelists.
Great, thank you so much for that, Jessie. So now with that summary, we will move to our panelists to learn of their vision for affordable, equitable, and sustainable transportation. We have a really great group of panelists from a wide range of departments today. So we will start by giving each panelist about 4 or 5 minutes to introduce themselves and briefly discuss how considerations of sustainability and equity influence their research on transportation. We are going to try to stick to our 1-hour schedule today, so if our panel discussion starts to expand past our time limits, Jessie and I will just give you a friendly reminder of the time in the chat. So firstly, I will ask Dr. Orly Linovski, Associate Professor in the Department of City Planning, to begin.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here with this group of panelists. So my research focuses on transportation planning for equity deserving groups. Obviously, that's a very sort of broad conceptualization, but thinking about how transportation impacts people from certain identities, focusing on racialized groups, Indigenous groups, people with disabilities, and so on, and thinking about how their experiences of transportation are different, and how we better provide transportation systems for those needs. So in transportation planning, we often talk about choice versus dependent riders. So choice, fairly self-explanatory. Choice riders are ones that have different options when it comes to transportation. And dependent riders are often limited in terms of what transportation options are open to them. Oftentimes it's public transit or walking. So and thinking about those different groups, my research focuses on sort of what are our goals in transportation planning. And unfortunately, there's often lots of conflicts between shifting choice riders to more sustainable modes, so basically getting people out of cars, and providing better service for people that are already using transit or other more sustainable modes such as walking, biking, and so on. So how are those conflicts managed, and what are the impacts on equity deserving groups when we think about sort of improving transportation services for them? So that's broadly my research. I've looked at it from a variety of different lenses. Some of it has focused on sort of the planning side of it, so thinking about how transportation planners discuss equity and approach it in their professional practices. Currently, I'm working on research that looks specifically at sort of federal government and their role in accessibility, particularly for people with disabilities, and applying an intersectional lens, but really sort of a wide range of thinking about equity deserving groups and how the transportation system serves them. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Linovski. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Paul Larson, professor in the Department of Supply Chain Management, to share a few words.
Thank you. Very nice to be here as well. I suppose my research in transportation has more had a focus on although we're realizing, particularly on the well, really both on the freight and passenger side of things, there's also very important equity concerns as well. Yeah, one thing that we work with on the emission side is there's the so-called 3 effects model. The 3 effects are activity, structural, and energy efficiency. So the activity effect is this based on the sheer volume of freight or people that need to be moved. And it seems like populations across Canada will continue to grow, so we can anticipate more activity. The trick then, of course, is to try to lower our emissions despite the fact that there'll be more activity, more folks, probably more vehicles on the road, depending upon how things get structured. The structural effect is all about modal shifts. So Dr. Linovski mentioned getting folks out of their cars in an urban setting, you know, whether onto the bus or onto active transportation, bicycles, etc. That's really what that's all about. And of course, that's also a big thing within the movement of freight as well. And then finally, the energy efficiency effect is all those things that can be done largely to the current vehicles, the current configuration to make things better. So these days, one of the major things talked about there is zero emission buses, right? Whether electric or hydrogen fueled buses to reduce the emissions, but sort of keep the same, you know, in a sense, the same vehicles going, but now they're just better. They're more energy efficient vehicles. Of late, we've had a specific focus, and I guess what makes me particularly excited about today is on urban transit. Again, getting folks out of cars on the passenger side, whether onto the bus or onto more active transportation. Here, I think there's a lot of opportunities, and of course, I think we'll get to this a bit later in the day. The pandemic has had a major effect on these sorts of things. Yeah, so I guess that's sort of it in a nutshell. I've been spanning both freight and passenger, and certainly have I just was going to mention, have tended to focus on the emission side, but for instance, in the trucking industry, there's a major driver shortage. only 5% of Canadian truck drivers are female, roughly speaking. And so the industry, this is largely an equity issue. You know, there's been some problems. The industry is trying to make itself more attractive to, you know, to more a more diverse workforce with special reference to gender. So let me leave it at that for now. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dr. Larson. Next, I will pass it to Dr. Adele Perry, Director of the Center for Human Rights Research and Distinguished Professor of History and Women's and Gender Studies.
Thank you, and thank you for this invitation. It's a nice opportunity to talk about something in a really interdisciplinary and kind of proactive context. And, you know, we don't always get a lot of those. So thank you for the organizers. So I come to these topics kind of in a pretty kind of circuitous way. I'm a historian, and I am kind of principally kind of concerned with histories of kind of colonization and their relationship to gender for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples over the kind of from the kind of the 18th century to the present in the context of kind of what is now Western Canada. And I'm not trained in any kind of meaningful sense as a scholar of transportation, but I am a longtime rider of buses, rider of bicycles, walker of sidewalks. And I think transit and space and priorities tell us an awful lot about the politics and the histories I am principally concerned with. And so the project that I think I'll speak about today, and I'm joined with one of my co-PIs, Dr. Jocelyn Thorpe, is a project that we took on that in particular wanted to build on a finding from the final report of the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women. And the research director of that was our other co-PI who's not able to join us today, Dr. Corinne Duhamel. And one of the findings of that report was a very specific call for sort of the recreation and the refunding of a national system of kind of public intercity bus transportation as a direct way of addressing ongoing issues of safety and contexts which create situations where Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples may find themselves targeted by those that might do them harm. And it seemed to me that in the wake of that report, that was one of the very sort of specific kind of calls that came out of the report that largely kind of dropped out of sight. And so I saw this research project as kind of an opportunity to kind of signal boost and return to that point. I also see it as an opportunity to address questions of history and where we see sort of the past of transportation. And I think one of the things that thinking historically allows us to do is to look at questions of transit and equity and sustainability in a context where we're willing to register the fact that change is not always linear and is not always positive. And certainly in the context of Manitoba and Western Canada, we have seen, you know, a marked decline in the possibilities of transit between spaces, between urban and rural spaces, between different forms of settlement over the course of the last 50 years. I think that's something that many of us can note just on our own experience. And I think we need to kind of take account of that in a more kind of rigorous way. So I would say my research is concerned primarily with, you know, more with equity than with sustainability, and in particular with kind of questions of decolonization, of what the world would look like if it took women, and in particular Indigenous women and Two-Spirited peoples, seriously, as if it took their experience of the world and of moving from one place to another in a serious and substantial way. So that speaks to questions of sustainability, though perhaps in kind of a more roundabout way. Yeah, so that's how I think, and I'm happy to kind of be a part of this conversation and to hear about all these plans.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we're happy to have you here. Thank you for coming. So next, I'd like to invite Dr. Jocelyn Thorpe, Director of the Center of Creative Writing and Oral Culture and Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and History, to share some words.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. And yeah, Adele and I are kind of, I don't know, are we flip sides of a coin, the same coin? I'm not sure. So I won't say the research part that Adele just covered. The parts that I will add about me are, I guess, number one, I'm a now that I have the language, thanks to you, a kind of a choice active commuter. Once I commuted, I remember, now I never leave my home. But I've always ridden my bike, and since coming to the U of M, I have as well. And Adele, among many others, have told me that, that's bananas and so on. And I have led myself to understand, especially on Pembina Highway at certain moments, that that's true, that that's the case. But then I'm always thinking, but it really shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be that I'm putting my life in my hands and, making a stupid decision to do something that seems smart in lots of ways. So things have improved, obviously, with the transit route and the bike lane and the no more Pembina Highway. Thumbs up to that. But yeah, I guess that's sort of one thing that I have in my mind, what makes sense, and then what makes sense for whom, and then how we kind of navigate those personal decisions that are related, of course, to these systems of inequality that we live in. And my PhD is actually in environmental studies. And so that is an interdisciplinary kind of thing. I did it at York University in Toronto, and I became interested in history there because I just wondered, how did we get here? And in trying to answer that question, then I learned a lot, like Adele, about histories and legacies of colonization, both social and environmental, and the ties between those two things. But I think because I've always been interested in gender studies and environmental studies, have been in what is considered to be like more activist kind of disciplines. And so as much as I really have found it helpful to think about and to understand how we got here, then now I'm really at, well, where do we go from here? And so I really find interesting and significant anything that's kind of like a where the rubber hits the road issue. And I think transit is certainly one of those places where histories and structures of injustice come together to shape the current situation, and even this idea of who is somebody who must take transit versus who is somebody who has the option of taking transit. But then also that kind of leads us to okay, well, given these histories, legacies, and inequalities, how do we work toward a just transition, I guess, and keeping the kind of justice in the forefront. And also I love that there are examples most recently about BC and caribou regeneration, where we see the ways in which, in fact, Indigenous knowledge and rights and responsibilities to land can, in fact, lead to ecological change. So I'm all for that, and I'm excited to be in this conversation. And I also have a barky dog, so I might turn off my microphone and camera at times to address him. Okay, thank you. Over.
Thank you so much. You brought up some great questions there that will hopefully be addressed today. So next we will hear from Sushreeta Mishra, a PhD candidate in the Department of Civil Engineering.
Hi all. So my PhD thesis topic is on optimization of semi-flexible transit systems. To make it in very clear words, like easier words. So semi-flexible transit systems are something that are not as rigid as a bus transit systems, like they run on fixed routes, fixed schedule, fixed stop locations, and they are not very flexible as a private taxi or a carpooling system, like providing door-to-door services. It lies somewhere in between providing a bus and providing a taxi. In this system we target the low demand communities or low demand conditions, basically where it is not very feasible to provide fixed route systems, because then the operator tries to reduce the cost by reducing the service frequency, and that would lead to reduction in operating costs. But then again, in some routes the services are not provided on weekends, so that doesn't ensure equity in service. Like regular bus transit system does not ensure equity in service, particularly in low demand conditions, which I refer is during the off-peak hours, on the weekdays in an urban areas, or the demand that we see, demand for transit that is there in suburban or rural areas. So semi-flexible transit systems are kind of the systems that can be said to be more cost effective when compared to the fixed route systems or the demand responsive, like the door-to-door service demand responsive systems. So it lies somewhere in between and would enable greater cost efficiency. So basically, these kind of systems are for like the semi-flexible transit systems can be more flexible to accommodate different kind of demand requests. And so my thesis is based on designing such a system. Like, is it feasible to provide such systems in low demand conditions, and how do we operate such a system in low demand conditions, and how sustainable this such as operating system will be when we talk in terms of long-term sustainability planning goals.
Great, thank you so much. So that leads us nicely into our first panel question, which is, from your perspective, what are some positive aspects and some shortcomings of transportation plans and goals in Winnipeg and at the University of Manitoba? So whichever our panelists would like to start, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
I would just briefly. And I think this has been mentioned in the first question. There's been a lot of good developments. Certainly the bike lanes, particularly coming to campus. Now, at least if a person happens to find themselves along a transit way, is a fairly seamless trip over to the campus, and so that certainly is a positive. The bus and bike concept, although there might be some capacity issues, if suddenly lots of folks wanted to do that, I think there'd be capacity constraints. On the other hand, there are some lingering shortcomings. I mean, there's always opportunities for more infrastructure. There's been some talk about almost like an app that's like a more specialized sort of Google concept to guide particularly cyclists through the city. That's something that would be very helpful. There's clearly ongoing safety issues, both for pedestrians and for that matter, bus riders, cyclists, and I suppose with special reference to some of the equity issues, gender issues. And then finally, and I hope I'm not stealing thunder from others here, but finally, winter, I mean, winter biking, particularly on campus, coming to campus. I guess I don't have any easy answers to it, but that could be improved, I suppose, if nothing else, through clearing the bikeways more readily. So let me leave it at that for now.
All right, thank you very much. Would any of our panelists like to speak to the positive aspects or shortcomings of transportation?
Sure, I can touch on that as well. I think, holistically, one of the shortcomings, and I'm in my academic ivory tower, so I can, I can be critical, and I sympathize with all the planners that are trying to work on this. But I think one of the shortcomings, and I think this really speaks to the work that Sushreeta is doing, is that we focused a transportation system on productivity, and you see it in all sorts of different ways, how we value different types of trips, where we invest our money, the absolute, ridiculous conditions in terms of paratransit, right? Like, how do you value trips? What are trips that are worth making? Where do we put our money to support that? So I think holistically, that's an issue. I think more concretely, we have focused on sort of incentives for encouraging people to take non-car modes, and we're not ready, it seems, to have the political discussion about disincentives, right? So if you look at almost every other jurisdiction that has very high rates of public transit and alternative transportation modes, they have very high rates of taxation on non-active transit and public transit modes. So the cost of gas, the cost of car ownership, the cost of insurance, and the time cost, right, in terms of congestion. So, you know, we have beginning conversations about how to improve our public transit and active transit system, but we haven't had any conversations about how to, not any, but we don't often talk about how do you discourage other types of modes. And you see it sort of on the campus too, in terms of the cost of parking for faculty members and things like that. So, you know, I would say, you know, a lack of consistent thought about sort of how rational behavior is, and how do we not only encourage, but how do we discourage other sorts of behaviors? And again, that requires political will and guidance that we don't seem to have yet, but I think hopefully we'll move in that direction.
Well, I was going to jump in and make a comment about parking, but Orly got there before me. I mean, I think one of the things we've seen is how rigid some of those commitments are. And I say this as somebody who pays monthly for a parking pass at the University of Manitoba. But I see this as something that is really kind of reflective of where our structural priorities lay. But I also think what comes up against that, to kind of go to Jocelyn's framing of kind of where the rubber hits the road, is the extent to which transit planning prioritizes certain kinds of trips and remains kind of inflexible for what kind of scholars of in particular of women's use of transit have talked about as the trip chain. And this recedes as an issue for me as my kids have gotten older, but certainly the timing of transit to campus, its locations, the places it connects to and the places it doesn't connect to, I think remain for a lot of people, in particular parents and mothers, a really substantive barrier to use. And then the costs of the alternative, in other words, parking and private vehicle ownership, remain modest in comparison. I also will note the extent to which transit schedules remain really seasonal at the university. And for those of us that are there as staff in one capacity or another and not as students, you know, often schedules are really good for the academic term, but after that become kind of pretty unworkable in a range of ways. So I think we've seen those reflections in pretty real ways, and seen on one hand movement on things like in particular the bike lanes, which is a game changer for a lot of people, but then also a lack of movement on things like transit lines that are really taxed or were before the pandemic. And I'm thinking in particular of the 36 here, which has been a bus route that gets a lot of attention and demands for more buses, and just doesn't seem to shift. So I think it's pretty clear kind of where some change needs to happen, but there seems to be some sort of institutional or thicker resistance to doing what needs to be done to actually make transit meaningfully usable for people who have other choices and for people who have complex demands on their schedule and on the way they have to move through space.
Thank you very much for that. Sorry, go ahead, Jocelyn.
Just one thing to add, during our research, one of the recommendations that we read about was that transit should be free. And I remember when I first heard that suggestion, I just thought it was the most radical idea. Like, it just seemed like, oh, that is just so far out there. And then it caused me to reflect upon how I think about things, and I think how we collectively have been taught to think about things, which is about cost and what the costs are. And I think also what is not included in the costs. And obviously the environment is not considered when we think about, you know, that being not affordable, not an option. And I think we also don't think about the infrastructure that we do support, that we do consider to be free, you know. And I think in Winnipeg, we spend a lot of time complaining about potholes and sidewalks being broken. And, you know, especially this time of year, just like, why is this not happening? This should be happening. The city should be on it. So there is no reason that we shouldn't have that same kind of thinking for actually, you know, why isn't this, like healthcare, a service that's provided that then when we make it amazing, safe, reliable, you know, all of these things, then that is like it just makes it good. And I think that we really need to rethink everything, and especially the way that we think about things, like the way that we understand problems and the way that we understand what's possible, and particularly when it comes to this idea of cost. And the last thing that I'll add is I think that the whole pandemic thing has shown what governments can do when it is necessary to spend money. And it's amazing, you know, these, like I went to the drugstore and got free tests the other day for, you know, rapid tests. And it's just like the expectation is that that's available and that that's something that we collectively can create through taxes and through income. And anyway, I think if we're serious that we are in a crisis, then we need to respond as though we are. And I think the pandemic gives us an example of a crisis that is related to the actual crisis. And it then gives us a model to say, hey, we can do things really, really differently. So free transit, obviously, that's also safe and awesome and quick, you know, and all those other things, like everyone can take it without being harassed, and they're not going to get whatever. All the bad things aren't going to happen. The good things are going to happen. People are going to arrive when they need to arrive. That's all.
Hi, I would like to add something too. So during the pandemic, I have seen like the 2 new services have been introduced, as of I know, like one of them is BRT, bus rapid transit lines, and the on-demand transit services. So basically the bus rapid transit lines are mostly designed for like high density routes, like where the demand is very high, and definitely solves the problem of overcrowding, which makes it easy for availing such services, and the service frequency is high too. And the on-demand services, as far as I know, are actually planned on the dart zones, and the same dart zones where for the low demand communities, for certain low demand communities. But where I see the drawback is I haven't seen any kind of innovative transit technologies that are used for serving the localities where the bus transit is provided, but the service is not it is not equitable. I mean, the frequency of service is very low, or the frequency of service is not provided on weekends at all. So planning to provide some innovative kind of transit services to account for those low demand communities should be also taken into consideration, because we have I mean, Winnipeg Transit has already designed a system like BRT for the high demand corridors. How about the low demand corridors? So some methodologies, some new technologies needs to be implemented in that section.
Thank you very much to everyone. Those are really great points that were raised. And it leads us very nicely into our second question here, which is, how do you see the future of transportation looking in our community 10 to 15 years from now? And how will this view be influenced by the global pandemic and rising costs of living?
I'll start off. I mean, I think we're at a moment where we're really having, you know, living in real time, just what it means to live through history, and to not know really, you know, I don't think many of us predicted where we're at right now a couple of years ago, and it's hard to predict where this will go in the future. But I will note that the overall kind of trends, I think, read in long historical terms in the context we're in, you know, we have seen really significant kind of de-investments rather than investments, and what will be required to turn that around, and not just in kind of pockets where there has been kind of success and investment, but as far as just an overall kind of context of provincial and civic funding for public transit within the urban context. And more particular, a really marked kind of collapse both of rail transportation in the context of Western Canada as a whole, and in the context of intercity bus transit, in the context of Western Canada as a whole, and now in Central Canada to a lesser extent. And so as much as I kind of want to be, because I'm, you know, a pretty reflexively optimistic person, and I think these are solvable problems, and concrete things like dropping fares would move the needle in so many ways. I also think it's worth noting that in the kind of long historical context, these are not buoyant times for those who take these questions of sustainability and equity seriously. We have seen a world where increasingly for people to be able to kind of get around in contexts of dignity and safety and reliability requires, a kind of a shift to automobility in one way or another. And I think that's a complicated kind of context, and one that we need to probably think seriously kind of about kind of what got us here and where we might move in order to shift that.
Wonderful, thank you. Would anybody else like to speak to the future of transportation? We can move on to the next question if needed.
I mean, I think it's oh, sorry, Paul, if you were about to. Okay. I think it's, I'm the opposite of Adele in that I skew towards negative, but I think one of the interesting things to keep in mind is, there's all these examples, where we look at other jurisdictions and other places and think that things have always been like that. And the one that always comes to my mind is Amsterdam and cycling. And we sort of take this perspective that it has always been like that. But that has been a result of, very targeted government intervention for the most part. So I think that is actually a cause for optimism, to think that there is a way out of this. There just needs to be really the political will and, frankly, the investment behind it. And you are starting to see some changes. You're seeing changes in terms of how the federal government funds infrastructure. I think they're moving at sort of the snail's pace given the climate emergency, and it really needs to be happening at a different pace. And you also see changes. Municipalities are increasingly looking about the impacts from an equity perspective, but again, it needs to have sort of the funding behind it and the commitment to making those changes at a much faster rate. I think the positive part is that we're capable of doing it, and the negative is that we need to have the political will to do it.
I was just going to briefly add one of the exciting possibilities, I suppose mostly on the emission side, is the so-called zero emission bus, that many of the larger municipalities are looking into. The technology is advancing, but one of the key questions is it's hard to justify a major investment in these more expensive buses until ridership returns. I mean, there's no point having a zero emission bus going up and down the street with nobody on it. I suppose even that's better than having a conventional bus do that. But it's there's a very exciting potential future, but it sort of all has to come together. And I think for transit, step one is to just get folks back on the bus and get more folks out of their cars onto the bus, and then make the more dramatic sort of structural or modal shift type moves.
Yeah, I would like to just add a few points. Like what I understand is given that the public transportation, like the bus transit, Winnipeg bus transit, these are highly subsidized. So it is also a good idea to see if the public-private partnerships, any kind of like the transportation network companies like Uber, Lyft, such partnerships or via such partnerships can be made with the Winnipeg Transit can have such partnerships with this the transportation network companies to lower down the operating cost. And then the since the public transportation still needs to be subsidized, even though there is certain partnership, I guess we would be the transit would be able to will be able to provide service to more people with a lesser cost, and also serving the low demand communities at the same time. So kind of public-private partnerships can be I mean, it's the perfect time to see, since the government cannot subsidize public transportation systems the way it was pre-pandemic and the post-pandemic system.
Thank you very much, everyone, for that. We're going to move to our next question here, which is, in what ways can improved transportation systems address global sustainability goals, such as the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, I can take a start. I mean, I think the thing that stands out to me is, so many of the goals are focused on poverty reduction, inequality, access to health, and issues like that. And transportation has a key role in that. In the previous work I did with Professor Dorries and Simpson at the University of Toronto and Carleton University, we really looked at sort of the impact of poor transit access for equity deserving groups. And holistically, the impact is so significant on access to health, access to education, access to work, to English training, that really, a dedicated focus on improving those outcomes for transit-dependent riders, I think will have knock-on effects on sort of all those other areas. I mean, just the amount of research that showed that people aren't going to medical appointments, aren't taking their children to medical appointments because of a lack of public transit, that is something that we can invest government dollars in. And unfortunately, on the sustainability side, you see a lot of research from the States that looks at providing car access, especially for low-income women who have multiple care duties. So I think we really need to think holistically about what the goals are. 100% we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but in terms of who is bearing the brunt of that in our wealthy Canadian society, I think is something that we need to look at really critically when we talk about sort of moving people out of modes and acknowledging the fact that currently, for the most part, the least well-off people use transit, and we have not been investing in improving their conditions and access to the destinations they need to go to.
I might expand on that a bit and focus. Orly mentioned the whole health and well-being angle in terms of getting to appointments and such. Part of what we've been doing within the scope of our active transportation research is trying to make estimates, and there is some information and data out there, but estimates on the impact of more folks actively transporting themselves on their health, and then ultimately on the healthcare costs in a nation such as Canada. And the early results seem to suggest that the savings that are possible by getting things right, with special reference to the active transportation, as well as the transit, because almost all transit trips are partly active transportation as well. Folks have to walk to the bus and they're more active. So it's almost like a double whammy, what Dr. Linovski was talking about in terms of folks avoiding medical appointments. Well, they're probably then just staying home and they're less active as well. Nonetheless, if the savings to governments just on the healthcare costs in a longer term scenario were then plowed back into a better transit system, it would be sort of an upward spiral rather than a downward spiral. So there's exciting possibilities. Part of it, I think, is just stating the case. I guess that's what we're really trying to do, is develop the case for investment in active transportation and transit, partly from the public health angle and the potential for billions of dollars of savings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move into our final question here, so we have adequate time to field some audience questions. So our final question is, what gives you reason to be hopeful in our transition towards a more sustainable and equitable future in transportation?
All right, I'm good at being hopeful. I think Orly and Adele already said it in another way, which is basically things can be another way. And I do think that that's kind of a lesson of history in general, that you sort of learn, like Orly said, this natural transportation system in Amsterdam is actually not natural at all. It's a result of history and people's actions and, some combination of the rest of the world too, like the non-human world. And so similarly, we can kind of take that lesson to say, well, just because things have been one way doesn't mean that they need to be this way. And also there are lots of good ideas out there, and that sometimes it's a matter of, well, I think academics like research, but I think there's a lot of research already done, you know, and then I think we could spend some time putting the research into action instead of doing more of it. Over.
I have something to add to. So basically, in terms of my opinion in terms of ride-hailing services, what I understand is this is a perfect. I mean, for low-demand communities or any of the communities. So ride-hailing services are more promising if we look in terms of electric vehicles. If the ride-hailing services are provided through electric vehicles, because these are the size of almost little larger than maybe a private cars, maybe vans, but again the miles traveled are very high when compared to private vehicles. So the payback period of those vehicles will be very less, and with time we have also seen, like from the year of 2017 or 18, we have seen a very good reduction in battery costs for the electric vehicles. So it kind of gives a hope that use of battery electric buses or the use of battery electric vehicles are going to be more promising, because when compared to the hybrid systems, even because of the because of the substantial decrease in the battery cost over the years. So that's kind of a good, a promising hope.
I would just very briefly add, on the pessimistic side, anecdotally, folks love their cars around here in Winnipeg, you know, so that's a thing. But on the other hand, I think the vibe I get from our students is that they're ready for change. They've got a very positive attitude about many things, such as this. And it makes me think of a brief quote from the legendary American civil rights leader, Angela Davis, where she said, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. And I this is kind of the vibe I get from my students these days.
That's good. That's good hope. I'm excited that Winnipeg Transit is planning, I think, to reinstitute a bus to Birds Hill Park. And one of the things that I am interested in is sort of the options, in particular for folks that are transit dependent, on what is framed as recreation, but in particular for mothers, you know, is actually kind of issues of kind of work and just access to state-funded, either federally or provincially resources, including beaches. These are sometimes framed as kind of rural problems in the sort of national context of transportation conversation, but I think Winnipeg provides an example. This is very much an urban problem as well. But I do think thinking about policy as if women mattered, I think we've seen people thinking about transit through that lens in ways that I think are kind of critical to shifting the conversation. Discussions of transit often kind of frame people as sort of oddly kind of genderless and raceless and identityless. And I think in doing so kind of misunderstand the way that limited and impoverished transit hamstrings people's lives and chances and opportunities. And also the way that thinking differently about transit is such a profound life changer in the ways that Orly sort of spoke about. So I think we can kind of put hope in that. I think we also, you know, and one of the things that one of our research assistants on this project, Batel Bellach, drew our attention to regularly, and I come back to often, is also the thinking that comes out of kind of abolitionist thinking in the context of Black Lives Matter and related social movement, that I think also provides us with really important critical ways for questioning securitization. And that is another thing that we need to think about alongside, questions of fair, but the extent to which very real concerns about safety that are articulated by women and gender nonconforming folks and racialized and Indigenous peoples cannot be addressed by kind of simply increasing sort of securitization. It can be addressed by downloading that work on drivers who are trying to drive the bus. And I think we've seen some kind of shifts in public conversation that have been driven through the hard intellectual and political work of, Indigenous and Black activists and scholars. And I think we can learn a lot about how we think about transit as kind of a radical possibility by attending to that and thinking about it. Including for those of us like myself who are white.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And to Dr. Larson's point, I am a student and a active commuter myself, and I am very ready for change and optimistic about the future. So now we're going to lead into some questions from the audience. So I have seen some really great questions coming in, but if anyone has a question they haven't asked, now is the time. So let's see what we have here. Okay. So there is a question here. If you were Premier or Prime Minister for a day, what would be your first step to move the needle on sustainable, equitable transportation?
That's a great question. I mean, I think my first step would to be reorganize the division of responsibilities for a lot of the ministries. Right now, it's incredibly siloed. So, you have one ministry that's thinking about physical infrastructure, but not about how it's going to be operated. You have another ministry that's thinking about the status of women. You have another one that's thinking about Indigenous peoples, when in reality, this is what got us into the situation, sort of this siloed thinking. So I think there needs to be a major reorganization in how we think about people's lives and how we fund programs to deal with it. So this comes up in the research all the time about sort of the siloization of programs and how it doesn't accurately reflect people's issues. So that would be my first day as Prime Minister.
Let me briefly say the first thing I would do is gather together a panel of folks that are actual users, riders of the bus, for instance. I mean, back in the day when I was director of the Transport Institute, we had a couple of meetings on transit, and I used to ask, well, how many of you folks ride the bus? Nobody. I mean, so another, you need the voice of the folks that are going to be on the bus or on the bicycles. That's the first thing I would do is outreach to those folks.
All right, thank you very much. Ray, I see you have your hand raised. Did you have a question?
Actually, Ray might not be able to use his microphone as a participant. So Ray, you might just need to type your question into the chat.
Perfect. While he's doing that, we'll just move on to another question. So Lisa here asks if there will be any impact from driverless vehicles on transportation and accessibility.
I can take that if no one else. I mean, it's a great question. We oftentimes think about the solution before we think of what the actual problem is. And I think driverless cars is an excellent example of it. I think, there's probably instances where they would be incredibly helpful. I'm sure Dr. Larson can speak about freight and things like that. But if we're trying to reduce trips, some of the literature on driverless vehicles talks about how it would actually increase it, right? So if you could, in theory, at whatever point in the future, have your car drop you off at work and then drive to cheaper off-site parking and then come back and pick you up, I mean, you've quadrupled the number of trips. If you can sit in the back of your car and not have to deal with anyone on transit and read or do whatever you want, your commuting shed is significantly larger. So I am not hopeful about the impact of driverless vehicles if you're thinking about sort of an urban transit, public transit perspective. You know, I didn't speak to the last question about what makes you hopeful, but I think it ties into this about sort of the organizing that's happening across issues of concern and sort of thinking about the interactions between labor organizing and you know, equity deserving groups and the impact of transportation. I think sort of that all ties in together. So one of the issues that would definitely come up from driverless vehicles is sort of the labor perspective. So I think it's important to think about that as well when we're thinking about sort of transportation impacts and sustainability. And it doesn't necessarily assist with the emissions issue.
I might just ever so briefly add, there's this expression, sometimes you solve a problem that nobody has, or maybe more to the point, one of the cool things about sustainability is you can solve one problem, but then create other ones. And sometimes the other ones are even bigger than the first one solved. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how things play out. And yeah, there might be in certain lanes more freight opportunities than passenger per se. But anyway, there's my 2 cents. But yeah, it certainly will be one to watch what happens.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. We'll do one more question here. Sorry, Sushreeta, did you want to? You can go ahead. You can speak to the question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, if in terms of autonomous vehicles, yes, it could improve accessibility of paratransit uses, because paratransit users are often very captive. I mean, the people with disabilities are often very captive of paratransit service, and the bus transit systems or the regular transit systems are not universally designed like to accommodate people with all kind of disabilities. So I guess in that aspect, autonomous vehicles are more would increase the accessibility of people with disabilities a lot. And I think for most of like usually the section of population who are being targeted for autonomous vehicles, for the use of autonomous vehicles, are people elderly drivers and the people with disabilities. And I guess it will have a lot of impact for these users.
Thank you very much. So we'll just take one question here, one more question in the interest of time. Brenna Rempel has a great question addressing safety and comfort. So they say here, if anyone has any comments on how to improve public transit safety and comfort, particularly during the pandemic. I know many people who stopped using public transit chose to drive more during the pandemic because of the crowded situation on buses. And in my opinion, I think a lot of people do choose cars because they find it safer in many meanings of the word. So can anyone address how we can make alternative transportation safer?
It's a really good question. And we've sort of spoken about it when it comes to this question of Black Lives Matter that Adele talked about, because what we have learned from the sort of secondary sources is that primarily Black and Indigenous people are sort of targeted on transit and experience transit as a source of the reproduction of systems of inequality. And partly that has to do with fares, like this assumption by transit officials that certain bodies are doing the wrong thing in space. And so that's why a police force in the transit is not necessarily like the good answer that's going to create more justice. That said, it seems like everybody wants the same thing on transit, which is to get somewhere affordably, safely, quickly, comfortably, so it's not like it's equity deserving groups who want some thing that nobody else wants. Everyone wants the same thing. And so then it's a question of how you create a sort of system that is that. And I think we can say that transit is also the world, right? That nobody wants to be harassed. The fact that certain bodies experience a disproportionate amount of harassment shows that systemic inequalities exist. And yet it's not a radical idea to want to get from point A to point B without getting hurt, without being delayed. And so I think that there are lots of ways to do it, but it also involves changing the whole culture, right? So the same with anything where if you don't put your kind of emphasis behind it, right? If you say, oh, well, you know, racialized policing isn't okay, but then you continue to do it, right? Or you don't put things in place to prevent it from happening, then it will still happen. And so, or, you know, sexual harassment isn't acceptable, but you don't follow up on the policies that exist to make it not something that's going to happen. So I think it has to be more of a general culture shift. But one small thing is that it can't be the drivers who are off, right, who have a job to do. And it cannot be that it is their job to also make sure that everybody's safe in the place. So that's kind of like a not answer, but it's 1 o'clock. So we're getting, you know, we're getting there.
If I could briefly add, to me, this is one of those issues that should be addressed from day one of the public ed. Kindergartners should be taught that how wrong and unacceptable it is to mistreat people, to harass people, you know, so that hopefully, I mean, this is a long-term solution or scenario, but hopefully over time it'll stop, because there's nothing more infuriating to me and I rarely get angry, but to imagine one of our students on their way to class, and as if that's not challenging enough, they're going to be harassed or mistreated on public transit, or for that matter on campus. But I think the key is education from day one in the public school system. My 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know there's also
as far as pandemic stuff too, we can also investigate things like better air circulation. We can open windows on buses. We can, you know, insist on a return to masking policies, which is something that we're seeing kind of happen in real time. And I think those are very kind of easy. Well, they're probably not easy, but they're certainly tangible things that could be done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We're a little over 1 o'clock now, so I apologize to those who have to head out. And sorry to all the people in the chat whose questions we didn't get to today. Thank you very much to everyone for being here, to our guests and our panelists for taking time out of their day to be part of this really, really great discussion on such an important topic. We've heard from a wide range of perspectives covering a really broad range of topics related to transportation. I'm sure our audience has learned a lot, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I know I have. So thank you again for everyone for your contributions to today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.